You know, my organization, American Family Association, we were involved at the very beginning of the Tea Party movement. Our founder and chairman emeritus, John Wildman, was an instrumental part of sort of planting this seed in the minds of the American people. We were the first organization to create a website that enabled people all over the country to organize Tea Party events and to communicate with other people that were interested in the same thing. This is back in the winter of 2009, kind of in response to Rick Santelli's rant that you are familiar with. And so, because I was still living in Boise, Idaho at the time, and because of the encouragement that came from AFA, this is before I was on staff with them, I got involved in the Tea Party movement and helped plan the very first Tea Party that we had in Boise, Idaho. That was April 15 of 2009. And I remember distinctly our first guest that day was an immigrant from Hungary. He'd been in this country for decades. And he got up and said, you know, the reason I'm a part of the Tea Party movement, and this is right after our president had virtually nationalized the auto industry, taken over GM, fired the CEO, and put a guy named Steve Ratner in charge. And the first thing Steve Ratner says when he takes over GM, I don't know anything about making cars. I have no idea how to make a car. And so this guy got up and said, you know, the whole reason that I immigrated from Hungary to the United States was to get away from that. You know, I saw what that kind of centralized power could do to an entire nation. So he said, that's why I'm involved in Tea Party, because I do not want to see the United States wind up where my country did. I think most of us in this room are probably, you know, conservative in our outlook, philosophy, and all that. I remember a story about an elderly man that suffered a massive heart attack, and so his family races him to the emergency room, and the doctors deal with him, and finally, after a number of hours, the emergency room doctor comes out and he says, I'm sorry to have to tell you that he's brain dead, but his heart is still beating. And his wife at that point just clasped her hand and said, oh my Lord, what are we going to do? We've never had a liberal in the family. I do a radio program, as Dan indicated, a radio program on our network, but you can stream it on afr.net. We've got both audio and video streaming, so if you don't have it.
And it's 88.5.
Oh, right here?
FM, right here.
Okay.
It's out of Kettle, Kentucky, but we can get
okay,
it here.
Okay, 88.5. It's on every day from 1 to 3 Central Time. Now, when I do a radio program, I take 2 books with me into the studio every day. I'll take a stack of stories, but I always take 2 books with me into the studio to do my program. And these are the 2 books right here. One is the Bible, because I agree with President Andrew Jackson. He pointed to this one time and he said, that, sir, is the book on which the Republic rests. And I agree with President Andrew Jackson. The other book I take into the studio with me every day is one of these. This is the Constitution. Debbie got me this nice little leather-bound job. I've had this paperback job since, I don't know, 1987 or something like that. So it's beaten and taped up and all that kind of stuff. Now, I got a quick question. Do we have some Constitutions for sale back there?
For free.
For free. Okay. Everybody needs to have
Best
one.
deal.
Does everybody have one?
If not,
okay, because we're gonna turn to a couple of sections in the Constitution, so everybody needs to have one. Now, the reason this is important is that, you know, we believe that words have meaning. You know, I believe when it comes to this book, for instance, I believe this is the infallible, inerrant, authoritative Word of God. I will believe that till the day I die. And this book either means what its authors intended it to mean, or it can mean anything that your fevered imagination can dream up. I remember Mark Twain one time talking about the preachers of his day who were already tampering with some of the truth statements in this book. And he said about the preachers of his day, they have a marvelous gift of explaining things away. Taking things that seem clear, unambiguous, straightforward, and turning them virtually upside down to where they claim this book meant something the exact opposite of what it plainly states. And so we believe, and that this is true of the Constitution. either the Constitution, you know, this is our supreme authority for life, and this is our supreme authority for politics. And the same thing is true of this book. It either means what the founders intended it to mean, or it can mean anything that a judge's fevered brain can dream up. And we've seen a lot of that happen, even in our own generation. You ever heard a story about a good old boy who went through one neighborhood that's looking for odd jobs to make a little money, and knocked on this door and said, "You got any odd jobs that I could do to make a little money?" The guy says, "Well, yeah, we need to have our porch repainted." They had a wraparound porch in their house. "We need to have the porch repainted." And the guy says, "Great, I'll do it for $50. The guy said, "Super. You find everything you need in the garage, the paint, the ladders, everything." So the guy's gone for about 30, 45 minutes, and he comes back and knocks on the door and says, "I'm all done." And says, "Wow, you work fast." And he says, "Well, yeah, in fact, I had enough paint left over, I was able to apply 2 coats. And so the guy starts peeling out the $50, and the guy says, "And by the way, it's not a Porsche, it's a Ferrari." So, so we believe that words mean things. You know, I heard a talk given by a guy who was an attorney with the Alliance Defending Freedom. It used to be Alliance Defense Fund, ADF. They're one of the best public interest law firms in the country, and they work on First Amendment issues to protect religious liberty. And I heard a luncheon address by one of the attorneys that works with them, a guy by the name of Jeff Ventrella. And he said he was given a lecture at Stanford Law School one time, which is one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. And he asked these students who were enrolled at Stanford Law School, he says, "How many of you in your time here at law school have taken a class in the Constitution?" And every hand in the room went up. Now, you're familiar with the Federalist Papers, right? These were the papers that were written by John Jay and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton to encourage the people of New York to vote for the Constitution. So it's one of the best sources of information about what the founders were seeking to accomplish, what they meant when they put the Constitution together. Let me give you one quick example. That has to do with the Commerce Clause. I want you to go to Article 1, Section 8 in your Constitution. Article 1, Section 8. By the way, let me ask you, let me have you look at the beginning of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 1. Article 1, Section 1. What are the first 3 words in Article 1, Section 1?
All legislative powers.
How many?
All.
How many?
All.
All legislative powers are vested in what?
Congress.
Congress of the United States. How many, according to the founders, how many legislative powers have been vested in the executive branch?
None.
0, zip, nada. Why? Because all legislative powers are vested in Congress. So does the executive branch have any constitutional warrant to enact policies on its own by executive order? The question.
No.
The answer is absolutely not. And that was the genius of the form of government that the founders left us, is that Congress was responsible to pass legislation. The executive branch was then responsible to take legislation that had been enacted by the will of the people, and the responsibility of the executive branch to do what? To execute that policy, to apply it, to implement it, and to enforce it, not to make it up, not to alter it, but to implement it. And then it was the responsibility of the judicial branch to apply it when there were disputes that needed to be reconciled. Anyway, go to Article 1, Section 8. You know, and I appreciate Brian putting that chart up about expenditures and all that. And you ask yourself the question, how would we get control of the spending of the federal government? And the answer is right here in the document that the Founding Fathers left us. Because Article 1, Section 8 describes in detail every single power of action that the federal government has. The only thing that the federal government can legitimately do, morally do, ethically do, constitutionally do, is something that's on this list. So for instance, you will look down, well, let me go to the third paragraph. You'll notice the second one, they can borrow money on the credit of the United States, correct? So the federal government, Congress, can borrow money on the credit of the United States. So borrowing itself is a constitutionally approved power of action for the central government. Now the next paragraph says that Congress has the authority, the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. So the Congress is given the power of action in the Constitution to regulate commerce among the several states. Now, if you remember, the Democrats, when they passed Obamacare, they tried to slide the whole thing in under that phrase, didn't they? Mm-hmm. It says it right there in the Constitution. They've got the power to regulate commerce. This is commerce. People are buying insurance, they're selling insurance. We have the power, the authority to regulate. Well, that's where the Federalist Papers come into play, because James Madison, in the Federalist Paper number 45, he explained what the Commerce Clause was all about. Now remember, you go to the end of the Declaration of Independence, and what does it say about the 13 colonies? They are and of right ought to be free and independent states. That's why it's the United States of America. There were 13 individual sovereign states. And these 13 states came together and they delegated certain powers of action to the central government. The states, we must never forget that the states created the federal government. It is not the other way around. And most people in America would have that completely reversed. They think that the federal government is supreme and that the states serve the federal government. That's not the way the founders drew it up. It was the United States that we need a central government with certain very limited powers to act on our behalf. So we are creating the central government. We are bringing it into being. It is the servant. We, the states, are the master. And we're going to carefully proscribe its powers of action, because we just came out of a period where we had this tremendous conflict with the tyrannical power. We don't want to repeat that experiment in the United States. So we're going to carefully proscribe its powers of action. Now here's where the Commerce Clause comes into being, because what they realized, we got 13 independent states that are sovereign states, and except for the powers they delegated to the central government, they act as sovereign and independent political entities. Now the problem, they said, look, is you're going to have people that are going to make goods in one state, and they're going to want to ship those goods to another state so they can sell them. And maybe those goods will have to pass through this state to get to the coast, where they can be put on a ship and sent to Europe to be sold. So the problem we're going to have is we're going to get these import and export wars, because states are going to want to charge an import tariff for you to enter their sovereign territory with your goods. And then maybe they're going to want to charge you an export fee to take it out of your state to the next state. So they saw the potential for division, strife, contention if you had these tariff wars between these 13 states. So they said one of the things that we're going to delegate to the central government is the power to regulate commerce, by which they meant to regulate the import and export duties and tariffs that one state could charge to another. And that is it. That is all that the Commerce Clause authorizes the central government to do. So you want to make something in Missouri and you want to ship it to Kentucky, the federal government is going to decide how much Kentucky can charge you to send, to avoid sectionalism and strife. That's it. That's all the federal government is authorized to do. So that's why the Federalist Papers are extremely important for us to understand. So going back to my friend Jeff Petrella, says, how many of you took a class on the Constitution? Every hand went. How many of you in your class on the Constitution of the United States, this is at Stanford Law School, how many of you were required to read the Federalist Papers? Not one single solitary hand went up. and realizes our judges come out of these law schools. So a lot of our federal judges have never read the Federalist Papers in their entire life. And one of the students came up to Jeff after the lecture, and he said, you know, you asked the wrong question in there. He says, oh yeah, what do you mean? He says, well, what you should have asked these law students is how many of you in your class on the Constitution were required to read the Constitution? And he said, you would have gotten exactly the same
Oh my gosh.
response. Because just like the scribes and the Pharisees of Jesus' day, they went entirely unprecedented on what the authorities on prior rulings from judges. And so I think it's critically important that we get back to the words and the meaning that the framers intended in the Constitution. Now I've got just a few minutes left, and I want to explore a couple of issues with you carefully. We could obviously, you know, the Constitution, we could spend hours and days on it, but I just want to focus on